Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining our series Conversation with Conservationists. And we're excited today. We have something a little bit special and a little bit different. You're used to hearing about all these, iconic animals and all that. Well, we have a different kind of iconic species. They may not be what you're expecting, and it is bats, because they are quite endangered and they are suffering around the world. First of all, because they're maligned, and also because of habitat loss and many other reasons. But we're going to let Jane explain all of that. So, first of all, what I'd like to do is I'd like to introduce Miss Jany Burd. She is the founding director of ReWild, which is located in the Limpopo province in South Africa. Hello, Jane, and welcome to Conversation with Conservationists.
Hi, Linda. Great to be on your show. Thank you very, very much for the opportunity to talk about bats.
There you go. Yes. A lot of people are going to be wondering, like, wow, how could we have a whole conversation about this little minuscule animal? But the fact is, it's really important to talk about them, how important they are to our environment, how important they are to our planet. And maybe we can give a different perception to folks about what these little animals are all about and how they're really cute and they're really kind of an important species for us to take care of. So first of all, let me ask you, what led you to start an organization that was kind of driven towards the conservation of bats?
I've always been involved in rehab. Not that young. I think I started looking after wildlife before it was fashionable and before rehab centers. So anything that was injured or hurt, I would rescue and help along and set it back free. And I then ended up, as one does, into the corporate world and all that kind of thing. And I felt I've always loved nature, loved animals, so wanted to make a difference. So I was volunteering at a wildlife rehab sort of one day a week. And I've always liked bats. They fascinate me. They're the only flying mammal. I mean, that in itself is fascinating. And so I started volunteering there, and I found out that they got quite a lot of baby orphan bats in every year. And I was like, well, can I be a bat mom? I want to be a bat mom. I want to raise baby bats. And yeah, and so the journey began, and I just fell in love with them. It's an animal that we know so little about. Even bat scientists know so little about them. There's so much more that we need to learn. But when you get to meet a bat, it's the most amazing experience. You have no idea what incredible animals they are. They're just super intelligent. They social animals, so they're very interactive and just different to any other wildlife. And I mean, I've been blessed to work with a lot of wildlife, and the bats just stole my heart.
We want to hear a little bit more about that. So tell me, how do the bats end up in your care at your organization today?
Various reasons. You do get orphan babies. Sometimes the babies fall out of a roost or fall off mum, or something happens to mum. And so people find them on the ground, etc. And very often we can actually get them back to mom. We take them out there in the evening, hold them up, and the moms will actually come and fetch them.
Oh,
And yeah, I've actually had moms come and land on my hand to assist with a baby that's been picked up. It was a youngster that's just learning to fly, so was very nervous to fly. And when the babies are learning to fly, they follow mom. And so I went out there at dusk. This juvenile had been picked up, and I stood out there with this baby on my hand. And mom was flying around, calling the baby to fly with her. And baby was very nervous. So mom landed next to the baby on my hand and then flew off, and baby flew off after it. So yeah, they're amazing. But other things are things like being caught by cats, domestic cats, obviously. And a very big problem that we have, the majority of our adult bats that come in are poisoned for roof roosting in people's roofs, and then the people poison them, and we get poisoned bats in.
That is something I wasn't
even aware of. That called me to rescue them and to get into not just the rehabilitation and rescue of them, but also onto the conservation side of them is the human-bat conflict. It's a very big problem.
All right, so
Yeah.
let's get straight into that then. Tell us what that means, and how do you actually end up working with communities to talk to them about, safeguarding the environment that these animals live in, and what people can do, to prevent the problem that these bats face because of human wildlife conflict.
Yeah. Yeah. You see, a lot of the species, or a good portion of the species, have taken to roosting with humans. They call it synanthropic bats. So they roost in man-made structures. So that's roofs of buildings, bat houses, and things like expansion joints of bridges. And like you guys have got in Texas, you've got some awesome bats on the bridges there. And the roosting in roofs is really where the conflict comes in. People obviously don't want them in the roofs. And that's an education thing. People have an idea that bats are dirty and full of diseases, which is completely untrue. They're very clean animals. And the disease idea of bats is a bit like, it's just blown out of proportion. And I think it comes from, the vampire movies and these kind of things. And they often take the rap, whether it was Ebola was blamed on the bats. They later found out that wasn't the case. But it ends up in the newspapers as this big story about, Ebola and bats. And nobody ever writes the story that, we were wrong. It wasn't Ebola and bats. So those kind of things also don't help them. And I think it's because it's an animal that's not well known, and people seldom see them. They just see something flying in the night sky occasionally, and that's all they know about bats. And so I think education is a really, really big thing. But with the roof roosting issue, it's actually a very complicated issue, in that, to understand it from the bats' perspective, these bats have learned to live in human roofs, in houses. And what happens is there are different ways to get them out. Very often what people do is simply spray them with poisons or seal them into the roof, or a combination. We've had bats come in that have been sprayed with poison and then covered in that expanding foam, as people have tried to seal them into the roof. So, I mean, they not only are they poisoned, but they're now covered in expanding foam. I mean, it's unbelievably cruel what people do. There's an idea that you can just kick bats out of a roof, and they have an idea that they call it a humane bat exclusion. It's not humane. And understanding this, and this is where I think the education is seriously important, is once people start to understand what the bats are facing, then they've got a lot more patience and compassion and a little bit more space in their home for them. And what happens is, with these humane bat exclusions, is they'll actually go in and you put in one-way doors into the roof so the bats can leave, but they can't get back in. And you do this outside the baby season so that no babies are left in the roof. And that's been sort of the method to humanely deal with the roof roosting bats. But what people don't understand is, and this is where things are changing, and they're changing globally. South Africa, we're a bit behind, is people are starting to realize that isn't actually the answer. And what the bats are inclined to do, bats are long-lived. They're not like a rat that's going to be around for a couple of years and dead. Some bats can live up to 40 years. So they're very long-lived animals. They're slow to reproduce. So they're very sensitive to persecution as well. The slow reproduction, many of the species only have one baby in a year. And when somebody goes in and sprays a colony of a couple of hundred bats in their roof, that's a massive loss. And in that, you don't replace that fast for them. Like I said, they only have one baby a year, and of those babies, only about 20% will survive their first year of life. That's a massively slow reproduction rate. And so they're not replaced. Now, with them roosting in roofs, what happens is, over the generations, those bats are learning that they live in roofs. So when you do this humane exclusion and kick them out, they go typically to the next roof. Even if you put up a bat house, because they're not used to living in bat houses, they go looking for a new roof. If they survive everything, they go for a new roof, and that roof, they bump into the same problems. And what they've found is when you kick bats out of a roof, even humanely, so to speak, where we're not actually killing them and spraying them with poisons, is they're under a lot of stress, and the stress alone can kill them. They can flood themselves to exhaustion because they can't find another roost. And that typically impacts the female bats. They're far more susceptible to the stress. They also find that they can't find proper roosts. So they're roosting in suboptimal places, which leaves them open to predation while they try and find a new roost. And then in the following breeding season, reproduction is reduced because of the stress the females have been through. And the chances are they're in another roof and they're about to be kicked out again, whether they're poisoned and the whole colony killed, or they get kicked out again and we lose more adult females and reduce reproduction, and so it goes. The UK have actually put in very, very strict regulations preventing people from kicking bats out of their roof, in fact, disturbing them at all. They kind of joke in the UK, the bats have more rights to your house than you do. And that is, they put in a number of measures to try and protect the bats because of the falling numbers. They were losing bats. Their numbers were just declining. And they put in various measures. And looking back now, because they're starting to recover species, they're looking back and saying, the only thing that we can actually definitely say made a difference was reducing the number of bat exclusions from roofs. And that's really where the education comes in, because we've also found that when you start speaking to people and you start explaining the situation, they start to see that, oh, we can't just kick them out. They're not just going to go and live somewhere else. You know, we can't just kick them out and say, well, we did it humanely and no bats were hurt and we did the right thing. They're starting to realize, well, just kicking them out, we're going to harm them as well. And that maybe we need to be a little bit more tolerant of them. So as well as education, we're also doing things like looking at ways of setting up bat houses that look very similar to the roof that they're being kicked out of, so that in cases where they have to be removed from a roof, we can create a bat house that can be positioned right where they're going in and out of the roof and looks very similar to the roof, that they can hopefully mistake it for the roof and move into the bat house. We have found areas where we've put up a lot of bat houses, and in a certain area, they get to know the bat houses over time, and we're able to set up colonies within those bat houses. So we're looking at various options to mitigate the impact that these bats are going through. But just this year, we get the tip of the iceberg when we get poisoned bats in, because most of them just die, and they've got very little chance of getting to us before they die. But just this year, we've had 5 different incidents of poisoned adult bats coming in.
So tell me, when you're recreating those, those different bathhouses, how far of a distance from the home do they usually travel to find another roosting place?
Depends on the species. Some species will fly typically sort of a 3 to 5 kilometer radius. Sorry, I don't know that in miles. Others will travel 50 kilometers before they even start foraging on a normal night. So they can cover huge distances. And both of those sort of ranges fall into what you'll find in roof roosting bats. And the biggest sort of conflict bat here, and probably the same in the States, is the free-tailed bat. In that they like to roost in really large colonies. So, if you've got 2 or 3 bats sleeping in your roof somewhere, you won't even know about it. But when they move in, and the free tails can be anywhere up to 2,000 in a colony, quite comfortably. So people know that they have bats in their roof. They hear them, they just have to stand outside in the evenings and they'll see them leaving the roof. So they're very noticeable. And that's where the majority of the conflict is with those bats.
There are so many species of bats in the world, and as you said, people have this impression that every single one of them is blood sucking and trying to come after us and down as a species. How many species do you have in South Africa? And tell us a little bit about what's the life of a bat. Like, I've seen them in the air and I've seen them eating, and I think they're the cutest thing with their big, with the big eyes, but other people think very differently. Tell me why people should care about bats. Like, what makes
Why they should care?
why should
They are so beneficial to us. They are super beneficial. And they're very different species. You get insectivorous eating bats as well as fruit bats. Your fruit bats are very much, obviously, they eat fruit. And they very similar to your flying foxes in Australia. A lot of people have seen those. And they're very much responsible for our reforestation. I think it's up to about 80% of the world's reforestation is thanks to them. And so they do a huge amount of reforestation and seed dispersal, and especially also for our wild fruits. And that's super important. Things like wild bananas and things, if we have issues with our banana crops where we need to bring back some of the wild banana strain into our commercial bananas, those fruit bats are keeping those wild strains of bananas going. So they are very important and very important for pollination. And they do things like pollinate the agave, which is the cactus that tequila is made from. So most people know that one. They're involved in so many of our foods and our medications and things like that. Our insectivorous bats protect our crops and also help protect us from disease. They're major mozzie eaters. Just a small little bat can eat like 1,000 mosquitoes in one night. So you certainly want them around from the mozzie perspective. But they're massively involved in crop protection. They're eating huge amounts of insects every night. The farmers beg for them all the time. The problem with, typically we spray our crops and our food and our orchards. And the problem with that is the pests develop resistance to the pesticides, which means that the farmers spray more and spray more and spray more. It's like an addiction. And what the bats allow is farmers to actually go organic. If they're using bats correctly, they can actually go organic and get off the pesticides. So those bats are super important to us. And there was a recent study actually done in the States where the States have had a very nasty fungus that's been infecting the bats called white nose syndrome. And some of the states have had huge losses of bats. Others haven't been as affected. And the study looked at the different states where they've lost a lot of bats and where they haven't lost a lot of bats. And where they'd lost a lot of bats, pesticide use had increased by 33%. And that was directly resulting to an 8% increase in infant mortality, human infant mortality. So, yeah, just to save ourselves.
So, Jane, tell me, what does a rehabilitation look like of bats within your organization?
So the bats will come in if it's a baby bat, and then there's a lot of milk feeding, which is, as most mammals, human babies as well, they feed over a 24-hour period, some of them as often as every hour. So it's a lot of sleepless nights to raise them. And then once they get old enough, we start to wean them onto mealworms. This is the insect bats, of course. The fruit bats we wean onto fruit. And as they get older, they start flapping their wings and getting stronger. And then we take them out into outdoor flight enclosures. And we're actually the only bat rehab in South Africa with a large enough flight cage to fly some of our free-tail bats. They need massive, massive space to fly. They can fly. They've been recorded free-tail bats. Your American free-tail bats, you've got way more research than we do, have been recorded at 160 kilometers an hour. I'm not sure what that is in miles, but I think it's somewhere around about 100 miles.
100 miles.
Very, very big spaces. So we've got a 20 by 25 meter flight enclosure for them. And that's ranges between 2 and 4 meters in height. Yeah. So those guys need huge space. And then they spend some time in the flight cage, learning to fly, learning to hunt on the wing. They also drink off the wing. So while they're flying, they'll swoop over some water and take a sip and then carry on. So they learn all of those kind of things, and then we release them. And that's not where the story ends. We then do what's known as post-release monitoring. So we monitor them in the wild to see that they're surviving.
How do you monitor them?
Firstly, some of the bats look quite different to their friends, but with the insectivorous bats, we have bat houses up for them, and we release them from their bat houses. When they're out in the flight cage, they sleep in their bat house, which is, it's training them to bat houses rather than roofs. And we'll then take, at the time of release, we take their bat house out, place it where they're going to be released from, and then the bats, we pop them back in their bat house, and then they release from there, and they come back to their bat house most of the time. And then we can monitor and see how they're doing.
From the moment that you get them to the time you release them, how long are we talking about?
It depends on the individual. Some are quick learners, and we'll have them out from baby to out in the wild at 3-4 months. Some of them will actually overwinter with us and won't be ready for release in their first summer. It absolutely depends on the individual. Some are, like I say, some of them are little athletes and they're off and away in no time, and others we have to do things like what we call flight school, where we'll actually go into the flight cage every evening, take the individual, hold him up on our hand, and you'll sit there and you'll look around, and then you'll go for his little flight. And those little guys often take a lot longer. In the wild, what would happen is mom would actually fly in front of them, and bats use echolocation, the insectivorous bats, where they make a sound either from the mouth or the nose, depending on species. And as that sound bounces off objects and comes back to them, they use that to determine where things are in their environment, kind of using sound to see. And when the babies are learning to fly, they actually tail mom, and they'll fly behind mom and actually fly off her echolocation. So they don't have that in rehab. They've got to go out and do it on their own, right from the. And for some of them, it's not a big deal, and for other bats, it's a lot more tricky to learn. And not only do they have to learn to fly, but they've also learned to catch insects in flight. So it's quite a big ask for them. They're not learning from mum. In the wild, they would be learning to fly with mum, and they would still be drinking milk. They'd finish learning to fly, and once they've got that down pat, then they're learning to catch insects and things, and they've got a lot more time and someone there to guide them, which they don't have in rehab. So it does take longer.
When you look at a bat, what is it that you're feeling, and what is it that you're sensing from them? Do you feel like they love the companionship? Do you think they know you? They recognize you when you come?
Oh yes,
they make sounds. So tell me about that.
And this is how I fell in love with them. I had no idea how amazing these animals are. They're super social. They use syntax, so they use a form of language where it actually matters, like the order of the words, etc. They have different dialects, and they can actually learn. It's called vocal learning, where you learn somebody else's language and you can use it. So bats of one species will actually learn the dialect or the language of another bat species and use it correctly. Oh my God. So they're super social and super intelligent. They are. I always say they'll make your dog look stupid. They play games, they make up games. It is quite phenomenal. But you can call a bat, like we give ours names, and I've had some people have a go at me about that. And we do other wildlife like squirrels and birds, and we're really bad at naming them, but we're very good at naming our bats. And the reason being is I can walk into my clinic and I can say, "Hey, Storm, you're up next for dinner." And he'll come out of his little roosting pouch, come to the door of his enclosure, and he's like, "Yeah, I'm ready." And they know their names, and they'll actually call me. I can be sitting in the kitchen and I can hear one of the bats calling me from the clinic, or I can sit in the kitchen and I can shout to a bat and it'll shout back to me, and I can say, "Hey, Maddie, are you ready?" And I'll get this little chit chit back. And that's what people have no idea about, is they'll do things in the wild like cross roosts. So you'll get bats that sleep with other species of bats. They'll go and roost with other species of bats. And And I think that makes them very open to relating to you, to working with you. They're very, very gentle animals. You know, if I have to go and pick up an adult squirrel, um, I'll make sure I've got a nice thick towel to pick it up with because it's going to try and bite me. If I pick up an adult bat, it's not going to try and bite. They're just such gentle animals. Obviously, I do have the experience of how to handle them and how not to frighten them because any animal frightened will bite. So a bat would bite if it's frightened. And we always recommend people don't touch them with bare hands, any wildlife, because it's likely to turn around and bite you. But the bats are just super gentle and they're very interesting. I'll tell you a story. This will give you an idea about them. We had an adult female bat come in and she'd been caught by a cat. She was actually pregnant at the time. And we were treating her in rehab and she had her babies in rehab too. She had twins, which is really exciting. And we allowed her to raise her babies. And then we put mum and the babies into the flight cage, got them nice and fit and ready for release. Because when bats fly to go out hunting, they'll leave the roost at dusk. Some of them will fly all night. Some of them will fly for an hour. And then they return to the roost. At no time do they go and land and catch their breath. So a bat will leave the roost. It'll fly for an hour or however long it's out hunting. Some of them will fly all night. And it comes back and it goes into the roost. It doesn't sit in a tree and catch its breath or anything like that. So the release preparation is super intense. Those bats have to be super fit. Otherwise, they're out there, they're flying and they're too far from home and they're not fit enough to get home and then they don't survive. So we have to have them super fit before release, which is the other reason we have massive flight cages to accommodate that. Anyway, this female came in and had her babies. We got them release prepped. We released them back into the wild. And she was staying around our bat houses. So we were able to monitor them and all that. And she'd been out in the wild probably for about 18 months. And we check our bat houses regularly to see who's there, etc. And we have a look. And as I go past in the evening, I see she's there. She's in the bat house, but it looks like she's just arrived, which is odd in the evenings because normally they're going out in the evenings, not coming in. And she's sitting in the entranceway like she's just arrived in the bat house. And I thought, well, that's strange. So I thought, I'm just going to watch her fly out and make sure that she does the fly out at dusk and that everything's all right because that's odd behavior. So I was standing a bit away from the bat houses at the building site. We're building a new clinic, which needs some funding. But we're standing there and I watch her fly out. Well, I watch one of the bats fly out and it must obviously be her. And she's flying really low and really slowly. And I think, oh, she's going to crash. This is going to land on the ground somewhere. So I turned to walk around to go and look for her. And on the wall next to me, she lands. I picked her up off the wall, had a look at her, and she had broken one of her fingers. Don't know what had happened to her out there, but she had obviously been sitting in the bat house right at the entrance, so saying, notice me, I need help. And I didn't notice. Well, I did notice, but I didn't do anything. And she sort of went, well, I have to go and fly over to her and show her I have a problem. So we brought her in again. We did a little external fixation, little splint on her finger. And she spent a couple of weeks healing up and then back in the flight cage, got fit, and we released her again. But she remembered, she knew who to come to, and she knew how to make herself visible because a bat typically will not land. Like I said, they leave the roost, they fly, they go back to the roost. They don't land on things. And she literally landed on the wall next to me, out in the open, which is putting her open to predation and everything else, to land there and say, here I am, please help me. And that's, yeah, there are not too many animals that are that clever.
You know, Jane, I hope that with all these stories and with what you're sharing, people are really going to get a whole different perception of these animals because it's so important. And as you mentioned, you know, they're facing so many threats around the world. Let's talk just briefly a little bit about that as well, because I don't think we really addressed enough how much these species are in danger, and
Yeah.
and what the impact. You've shared a little bit about the impact, but I think we really need for people to understand. Bats are so important to our environment. They're important to the biodiversity of the planet.
Yeah.
And just share a little bit more about that, if you don't mind.
Yeah, and this goes for a lot of our wildlife. A lot of our wildlife is facing a lot of things in common with bats. It's habitat loss, it's climate change. And with the changing in climate, the faster something reproduces, the faster it can adapt. And that's why your pests become pesticide resistant far faster than the predator does, because your pests reproduce quickly, so they can build up resistance, they can make the changes, and that enable them to survive. Whereas animals that breed slowly, it takes a lot longer for them to make change, which makes them more susceptible to things like climate change, habitat loss, etc. The wind farms are a problem for them. They can have lung embolisms just flying near those blades. The change in air pressure can cause a lung embolism. And those blades also move at a hell of a rate. So a lot of our birds are being taken out by the wind farms as well as bats. We're losing huge numbers of bats to the wind farm.
Mm-hmm.
So those are, and then of course there are all the pollutants and pesticides and everything else that's nailing all of us. And the bats are susceptible to things like our light pollution, our noise pollution. They live on sound. Sound is their main thing, and we're very noisy creatures. So we're polluting from a noise perspective as well as a light perspective, because some of the bats won't. Some of the bats will actually, it benefits them in that they'll go and hunt around street lights and things like that, whereas other species will stay out of the light.
Mm-hmm.
So they're getting less and less space to hunt in and survive. So we need those natural areas where it's quieter and not lit up for the more timid species.
Tell people, what ReWild is all about, what the organization, do you take on volunteers? How can people give to your organization? Because I think as people are going to realize how critical the work is that you're doing, they're going to want to help. And so how do they do that? Tell us.
Yeah, we don't typically take on volunteers in that unless they want to volunteer long term. And in that there is so much to learn. It's a lot of stuff to learn to work with bats. Just there's such different animals, how to handle them, etc. There's a lot of training that we find. Short-term volunteers that want to come for a couple of weeks, we just end up doing a lot of training and we don't really get a lot of help. In that the people are just learning. So we are more focused on people who want to come long term. But yeah, funding is the big thing. That's what makes the difference. That's what enables us to go out and do educational talks, go out to, because we do deal a lot with the bats and roofs issue, whether it's going out to mitigate and whether it's going out to, unfortunately, deal with poisonings in roofs, etc., and be there to help get bats out and to help people to learn to live with them and find ways that we can accommodate both the humans and the bats. Because very often there's specific reasons. Some people will just say, oh, I've got bats in my roof, I want them out, and a bit of education, and they'll overcome that and go, oh, okay, the bats actually aren't a problem. I can leave them on my roof. They're not going to chew the wires or do anything like that. Other people, it might be a case of, the bats are being a bit noisy. Can we do something like soundproofing, or can we move them to a different area in your roof? I've had people where the bats are roosting right above their bedroom and they're keeping them awake at night because the kids are learning to fly, and then they squeak a bit and while they're flapping, and we've said, okay, would it be all right if we move them to a different area of your roof? And then we've just gone and pushed them over and sealed them up onto the other side of the house, and so that the people can sleep and the bats can play all they like on the other side of the house. And so we try and find find a win-win situation for the humans and the bats, because most people, once they get a bit of education, they're starting to see the problem and saying, okay, well, if I kick my bats out, what happens? I'm not removing a problem, I'm actually moving the problem to my neighbors. Most people, I think at this stage, we understand how important conservation is, and we know that we need to look after our natural resources. So people don't want to be out there killing the bats. And it's helping them to understand what the bats are facing. And these bats, a lot of the species, we can't even find them in the wild. They don't roost in the wild anymore. And it's all very well saying, well, they need to go and find a hollow in a tree. Well, they don't know that. As far as they're concerned, they live in roofs. So a lot of what we aim at is educational. We also train some of the game rangers and tour guides and things as well about some of the facts about bats, which a lot of people don't know, which allows them to educate their guests. We do a lot of educational talks at schools as well. So the funding is what makes that happen. It's donations are our biggest thing and what we're desperately needing. We recently went through some very severe floods here, so we're having to do a lot of fixing up and rebuilding. We're busy building a new clinic because our current clinic is falling down since the floods. So yeah, we are desperate for funding.
Jane, tell us again, are you hopeful for the future of bats in the wild, and what gives you hope or what gives you concern?
Yes, I'm hopeful, but there's a lot of work to do. And I'm hopeful. I think that's more a personality side of things. I wouldn't do this if I didn't have hope. But yeah, I am very, very concerned. To give you an idea, we've been operating here since 2015. That's when we started. When we were officially registered, we were kind of working since 2014, but not officially. And back then, we were getting easily, I'll just take one species, the little free-tailed bat. We would get in 15, 20 babies, orphan pups a season. And the last few years, I'd say probably the last 5 years, we've been getting about 3 in every season. And this last season, we got 0 in. I'd love to think that that's because the bats are doing so well that none of their babies fall out the roosts and none of the mothers die, but I fear it's because we have less of them. We not only deal with people not wanting them, we also have a lot of South Africans have superstitions around bats where they feel that they're evil spirits, and they'll kill them on sight. So it's a huge amount of education. Education is probably the biggest thing. We're also working with looking at getting stronger legislation in place. But if I had to choose between legislation and education, fortunately I don't, but education is the thing that makes the biggest difference, because what somebody does in their house, in their roof, nobody knows. It's very seldom that you actually catch somebody killing the bats, because legally they're not allowed to. The law does protect the bats here, but the law is not effective in itself. The real change has to come from the people.
I'm going to encourage people to go to Jane's website. There's a lot of information there that they can get. Jane, thank you so very much. I have learned a lot, and I'm sure that a lot of people have as well. What are some of the final words that you'd like to say? Obviously, I want to say to people, look, you have easy ways to help Jane right away. One is just sign up, subscribe to her YouTube channel, subscribe to her social media sites, go to her website, donate. Even sometimes we think that it's not enough, but every little bit makes a difference. And I'm urging folks to just go directly to our website, to the link that we're providing, and donate. So Jane, thank you so much. Final words.
Thank you, Linda. Maybe I'll just tell you one little bat fact that I think is worth knowing, is the mummy bats talk to their babies in something called motherese. And that's something that we use as well with our children and our pets very often. And that's when mums talk to their babies, they use a squeaky little voice and change their tone a bit, like, hello, my little one. Mommy bats talk to their babies like that. Um, they're so similar to us. Um, you don't find these kind of things in other animals, and it would be a real shame to lose them.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to see what you do next. We've always said, as you know, folks, Safe Worldwide is really about protecting endangered species and the habitat, but you don't have to be necessarily recognized as an endangered species to know that you're critical to the environment and critical to our planet. We need bats in the world, folks. Jane has explained so eloquently. Think about what Jane said and think about the fact that these animals are sentient beings. They are feeling animals. They are just like us. They care about their young. Think about them a little bit differently the next time that you're actually seeing a bat in the wild or in your own home.
Yeah.
Jane, thank you so very much. And again,
thank you, Linda.
You're very welcome, Jane. And we will be looking forward to what you're going to be doing next. Thank you, everyone, for joining.